He was imprisoned for his prominent role in the 1798 rebellion against British rule in Ireland and considered fortunate not to be hanged. Yet he went on to become Belfast's richest man. He was the son of a Scottish Presbyterian minister of traditional Calvinist views. And yet, his private life was cloaked in scandal.
I've counted 13 children that he had with a number of different women.
His name was William Tennent.
And he was a man who was to shape the cultural, commercial and political life of Belfast.
You know, this is a man whose position in society didn't happen by chance. He was a kind of a calculating individual, I think, and very, very shrewd.
And he was a central figure among Belfast's radical reforming elite.
A man of business who not only made money, but who wanted to transform the face of the town in which he lived.
The late 18th and early 19th century was a defining period in the history of Belfast. It was a place of change, where the population was doubling every decade. Not only a developing centre of commerce and industry, but a place of ideas and debate. A town that defined the extraordinary life of William Tennent. This striking and elaborate memorial in First Presbyterian Church in Belfast's Rosemary Street was placed here in the 1850s. It depicts one of the leading citizens of this town, and for many years, its wealthiest. This is William Tennent.
Now, this is the first time I've ever seen this memorial, and yet it provides a window into a very different Belfast than the one we think we know today.
The memorial gives us some clues to William Tennent's many achievements. He is shown in a classical pose, reading a book, a work of literature, or maybe a company ledger. For when you look at the inscription underneath, it says his intellectual pursuits were funded by an arduous mercantile career. At first glance, this seems a tribute to an educated and respectable businessman.
Now, this inscription begins to tell us a little bit of a story. It says that Tennent was a consistent advocate of free inquiry, that he believed in principles of liberty, and that he was moderate in times of popular excitement. So we're beginning to get a little bit of a clue about the extraordinary life and times of William Tennent.
This is pew number 65, where William Tennent once sat. And from here, we can revisit his life. Out into the heart of Belfast, a town whose streets in the late 1700s and early 1800s were alive with liberal, rebellious and charitable citizens. It was a vibrant world of change and possibility. As an adult, William Tennent may have lived and worked amidst the noise and tumult of Georgian Belfast, where his private life risked scandal and his political views put his life in danger. But he spent his early years in a very different environment. He was born near Ballymoney in County Antrim in 1759, the eldest son of a Scottish Presbyterian minister and his wife Anne, who had settled in Ireland 8 years earlier. Together they raised a large family of 5 boys and 3 girls. As well as bringing their children up in the Presbyterian faith, both parents were vocal about challenging those in power when necessary. William's mother, Anne, was said to be possessed of a singular aversion to any of her family being slaves to landlords, while the Reverend John supported Catholic emancipation and parliamentary reform. These are the values William Tennent absorbed as a boy here at the family homestead, and he would live by them until the end of his life.
So I'm in the townland now of Ballyrobin, you can see here. I've just been down at the Bush River and walked up a path along here, and here we are round about here at this moment in time. This is a map from 1805, and this was formerly Tennent family land. You can see that from a ledger from the period in which plot number 3, which we've just been on, the Reverend John Tennent, which is William Tennent's father in this area at this time.
William's father, the Reverend John Tennent, died in 1808. But more than 200 years later, the church that he established at Rose Yards is still flourishing today. So Mark, what can you tell me about the Reverend John Tennent?
John Tennent was the first minister here at the Rose Yards. I'm the 10th, and he began here in the year 1751. He would go on to be the minister here for 57 years until his death in 1808. Later generations would say that he preached here every single Sabbath, every Sunday, throughout that whole time.
So what was life like back here in the middle of the 18th century for the Tennent family?
It would have been a fairly simple, rural lifestyle. They wouldn't have been all that well off financially because the congregation would have been made up mostly of tenant farmers, maybe a few tradesmen, craftsmen, but none of the landed gentry, few of any wealthy professionals, and his salary would have come out of the offerings given by this church.
So William Tennent left this area. What ideas and what notions would he have taken from his father and from the congregation?
Loving God with all his heart. The importance of education would have been there too, because everybody ought to be able to read the Bible for themselves. Also to show respect for civil government, and yet at the same time not to give it your absolute allegiance, because such allegiance should be given to God alone.
Tennent never forgot the values that he had been taught during his Presbyterian upbringing. But his ambition and lust for adventure took him away from Rose Yards. He went first to Glasgow, where he served as an apprentice merchant. And then in 1781, he settled in Belfast, a town that was alive with trade and commerce, a town with opportunities for a young man like William Tennent. At the time, Belfast consisted of not much more than a handful of streets built around the mouth of the loch, and it was owned by just one aristocratic and Anglican family, the Chichesters. For his services to the Crown, Sir Arthur Chichester had been granted 250,000 acres in the early 1600s by King James I. This included Belfast and the surrounding land. From this vantage point at the top of the Belfast Hills, you can really get a sense of the vastness of the Chichester estate, which stretched as far as the eye can see. The Chichesters built an impressive castle on High Street, said to be the glory and beauty of the town, and they effectively ruled Belfast until 1708, when a fire swept through the castle and burnt it to the ground. Afterwards, the Chichesters left for England, and for the next 100 years, they were to be absentee landlords. This was the Belfast that William Tennent arrived in. It was a town on the brink of great change, a change in which Tennent was to play a leading role. In 1781, it would have taken William Tennent almost a day to ride from the family home in Antrim to Belfast, where he'd established himself in business. So Reverend John Tennent kept in touch with William by letter. This correspondence was the start of an extraordinary family archive that is preserved here at the Public Record Office in Belfast.
All of William Tennent's life, both professional and personal, is laid out here in these boxes in meticulous detail. The first thing that really jumps out of these letters is that Tennent's influence stretches far and wide, and most of that comes through industry and commerce and trade. These documents provide not only an insight into Tennent and, of course, the Tennent family, but into Belfast itself.
And at the time, it was a town full of money and excitement, something that was of great concern to the Reverend John Tennent back in Antrim.
Oh, William, dear William, I fear you're now in a most dangerous situation, if you be not changed from what you was when I saw you last. Did you ever consider the difference between the gracious favour of Almighty God and his awful and just frown?
From the mid-1600s, a steady stream of Scottish Presbyterian merchants had sailed up this loch and settled here in Belfast. They leased plots of land from the Chichesters and began trading out of the port. The merchants exported linen and agricultural goods across the Atlantic to North America and the West Indies. The returning ships brought back cargoes of tobacco and sugar.
At the dawn of the 1760s, a traveller came to Belfast and he observed the hive of local activity. And he wrote, "There are many traders and merchants of substance here. It seems to me to be the London of the north of Ireland."
The town, however, was in dire need of improvement. In the 1760s, it was still contained within earthen defensive walls. It lacked public meeting places and broad, well-laid-out streets. The current Chichester, who had recently acquired the grand title of the Earl of Donegal, was keen to make Belfast a shining example of a Georgian town. But in order to achieve this, he needed the help of the wealthiest group of people in Belfast, the Presbyterian merchant class.
This is a map of Belfast from 1791. Now that's significant because Tennent would have been in Belfast for 10 years by that stage. And actually what's striking about it is just how small the built-up area of the town is. Most of the names are actually very recognisable. So you have the Newtonards Road going out to the east, you have the Lisburn Road, the Falls Road, the Antrim Road, the Shankill up here. But actually these are just fields, tree-lined avenues with a few gentlemen's homes and a few farms. The key thing really is that all those roads are pointing right into the centre, right into the commercial hub of the town. And it's in this tighter-knit series of streets and alleyways that one really gets a sense of the world of William Tennent. So there's Waring Street, which is the main commercial hub coming in from the docks, High Street, where the main shops would have been, Rosemary Street, First Presbyterian Church, where he worshipped, and just round the corner, Hercules Lane, where he lived.
The merchants of Belfast also leased land along the loch shore and built new quays to accommodate larger ships. And there was one addition in particular, a new building that was to become the lifeblood of Belfast. This building lay at the heart of the new fashionable town. It was a building that William Tennent knew well. It stands at the junction known in the late 1700s as the Four Corners: Rosemary Street, North Street, Donegal Street and Waring Street. It was initially built as a market house by the Donegal family. Then an extra storey was added and it gained its present name, the Assembly Rooms. Today the upper floor is missing, but you still get an impression of the sheer grandeur of the building.
This is where the young men of Belfast, merchants and preachers and teachers and doctors and lawyers, all met together to do business and exchange goods and services. But they also exchanged ideas, radical ideas, ideas from the Scottish Enlightenment and thinkers such as Francis Hutcheson and Adam Smith.
These philosophers and economists began to challenge the foundations of the political order. Young men like William Tennent followed suit and started to question what was unreasonable in their own town and country. At the top of their list was the way Belfast chose its representative in the Irish Parliament. The local MP was nominated by a 13-man corporation that was essentially hand-picked by the Earl of Donegal. So it was Donegal's friends and family who kept a vice-like grip on the town. For all their money, merchants like Tennent had no say over who represented them.
A new buzzword began to circulate: reform. And discussion about how to bring it about fueled the intellectual life of the town.
It's easy to understand why the Belfast of the late 1700s was so alluring for a young man of William Tennent's background. Not only was it a hotbed of radical ideas and a place with a vibrant social and cultural life, it was also a place where, with hard work, came the promise of untold riches.
William began his career as a merchant in this street in 1781, and the clue to his choice of trade lies in the name of this passageway, Sugar House Entry, named after the large sugar warehouse that once stood here.
Having come from the Caribbean plantations as raw cane, the sugar was refined and sold on as a luxury good. It was a lucrative business, and within a couple of years, the Reverend John Tennent commented wryly that his son William was rolling in money. However, William's new trade was already embroiled in a wider debate taking place in Belfast, a debate on the morality of slavery. Nini, could you tell us about the growing popularity of sugar in the 18th century?
Well, in the 18th century, sugar was a really, really important and popular crop. It was new, and from the point of view of making money out of it, it was really like owning an oil well. All over Ireland, for example, every port in Ireland by the 18th century would have a sugar house. Sugar can be seen, of course, as a luxury item at this stage, and of course it goes into things like sweetening alcohol, and then at the time that you get sugar coming in, you also get in the sugars coming in from the west. At the same time, you're getting tea coming in from the east, and when this arrived, the tea and the sugar, which were both fashionable and new crops in the 18th century, when this arrived, everybody sugared their tea. It was a great thing if you were well established and thought of in a place like Belfast to have money. You would have a beautiful tea table, and you would have sugar on the tea table. On the table you could have sugar tongs, and then you would drop the sugar into your tea. Then you'd have a sugar bowl and you'd have a silver jug as well. So all these things were a sign that you had arrived, that you were a wealthy merchant in Belfast.
So we have sugar, which is a real luxury good in this era. People are using it for their tea parties and also in the creation of alcohol. But there's a contradiction here, isn't there? Because on the other end of the spectrum, those involved in the produce and the making of sugar are actually slaves living in very difficult conditions.
People in Belfast who read the newspapers are well aware that a lot of people are saying that, you know, sugar depends on slavery, slavery depends on the slave trade is like cruel and vicious. In Ireland, William Tennent believed in Catholic emancipation. He believed in parliamentary reform, but he was not interested or excited by the fate of the slaves. If you were a radical in Belfast at this time, you might be excited by this new anti-slavery and your conscience might be pricked, or you might not. But what you would be aware of is that anti-slavery was a growing movement at this time.
William Tennent was rising up the social ladder, and before long he was one of Belfast's richest men, thanks to his aptitude for trading goods back and forth across the Atlantic. He was also becoming one of the town's most well-known and influential citizens. He had joined the board of the newly formed Chamber of Commerce and was a keen supporter of the Society for Promoting Knowledge, which would later become Belfast Linen Hall Library.
However, he was about to jeopardise both his wealth and his meteoric rise to the top of Belfast society by becoming involved in a movement that was gathering momentum in Ireland.
Today, 60 local councillors meet in this chamber in Belfast City Hall to debate the city's most pressing issues. And in doing so, each and every one of them represents the interests of the citizens who elected them.
Local politics was very different in Tennent's time, however. For all the money and for all the wealth that he and his friends brought to the town, they had very little political influence. In fact, they didn't even have a vote.
That right was still monopolised by Belfast's landlord, the Earl of Donegal, much to the frustration of men like William Tennent. And that frustration was stoked by events taking place far from Belfast and driven by the twin ideals of liberty and democracy: the American War of Independence and the French Revolution. Belfast was considered to be the most radical town in Ireland, perhaps the whole of the British Isles, and its political activists sought to make connections with those who shared their views. And so, in the autumn of 1791, they joined forces with the Dublin solicitor Wolfe Tone and founded a new society that was to change the history of Ireland forever. Its objectives included equal rights for citizens of all faiths and the reform of Ireland's unrepresentative parliamentary system. It was called the Society of the United Irishmen. William Tennent publicly demonstrated his support for the United Irishmen by providing financial backing for their newspaper, the Northern Star, which was first published in 1792.
The paper's masthead proclaimed, "The public will our guide, the public good our end." And for the next 5 years, it was to be a constant thorn in the side of the government.
And its popularity can be measured by the fact that at its peak it had a circulation of 4,000 copies, larger than any other contemporary newspaper.
There were reports from London where the slave trade was being debated in the British Parliament. But here in 1797, you really have the pinnacle of Ulster radicalism. A letter in the Northern Star from the United Irishmen, which is essentially a call to arms. Ireland should be free, urging them to cast off the yoke of England. And here, in the midst of all this excitement and news from France and the revolution there, William Tennent is doing business. It says here that William Tennent has for sale barrels of raisins and figs, and he's also well supplied with old port wine, sherry, and Jamaica rum.
A year after the launch of the Northern Star, the French revolutionaries beheaded their monarch, Louis XVI. Alarmed by this, the British government took a hard line with potential revolutionaries in Ireland, and in Dublin, ruthlessly suppressed the Society of United Irishmen.
The only remaining solution for the members left in Belfast was to go underground, and they began planning an uprising in earnest.
The Irish House of Lords now viewed Belfast as a disloyal town, condemning it as the rankest citadel of treason in the kingdom. In this climate of intrigue and rising tension, the Reverend John Tennent heard a rumour that William had become involved in the revolutionary politics spreading across Ireland. Perturbed by this news, he wrote an anguished letter to William.
When I mentioned it to your mother, she could not rest till I wrote you to keep far distant from such dangerous combinations.
His father's worst fears were realised, because on the 6th of June 1798, as rebellion raged across the country, Belfast was flooded with the military, and William Tennent was arrested and imprisoned. So the 6th of June 1798, can you give us a sense of the scene of Belfast at that moment in time?
I would imagine it would be pretty chaotic. The army had been active in Belfast before that. There had been a riot where they closed the offices of the Northern Star. The Northern Star was the mouthpiece of the United Irish organisation. That had been shut down in 1797, but the atmosphere would have been absolutely chaotic in Belfast on the 6th of June 1798, and before that as well, because news of the outbreak of the rebellion down south in Wicklow and Wexford would have reached Belfast by that time.
So William Tennent was a very wealthy man with a lot to lose. What was the nature of his involvement with the United Irishmen?
Tennent had been involved in the United Irishmen right from the very beginning. He was a member of what was called the Secret Committee of the Volunteers. Some of the volunteers in the 1780s were not satisfied with what they achieved, the legislative independence of the Irish Parliament, and they wanted to press on for more radical reform. And he would have met Wolfe Tone when Wolfe Tone came to Belfast in 1791. So he was a United Irishman right the whole way through. And his involvement in 1797, 1798, first of all, he was a wealthy man, so he was probably giving money for arms purchases. He was certainly, because of his status in Belfast, he would have been in the upper ranks of the movement, and he would have come to the government's attention through that.
So these are very dramatic scenes. The military swoops in on Tennent. What happens to him after he's arrested?
Tennent's name crops up in the Black Book of the Rebellion, which shows how serious the government took his United Irish activities. He's sent on board the Postlethwaite, which was a prison ship moored in Belfast Lough, where suspects like William Tennent would have been placed until the government knew what to do with them. Tennent, as I said, was a wealthy Belfast businessman, and it would have been a tremendous shock to the system to be placed on board a prison tender like a common criminal. But it probably saved his life, because undoubtedly Tennent, as a young man, would have been involved in the 1798 rebellion. He would either have been killed in battle or arrested and subsequently hung.
The authorities considered Tennent a dangerous figure, not merely the financial backer of the Northern Star newspaper. He was accused of trying to enlist men in the rebellion against King and Constitution, and was to stand trial on a charge of high treason. If found guilty, he risked meeting the same fate as Henry Joy McCracken, the leader of Belfast's United Irishmen, who was hanged in Cornmarket in 1798. On board the Postlethwaite, the prison ship moored in Belfast Lock, Tennent endured miserable conditions. Below deck, portholes remained open and the prisoners were buffeted by the wind and drenched in seawater. On deck, conditions were even more treacherous, as William Tennent discovered when he slipped and fractured his leg. As a result of his injury, he was brought back to shore and placed under house arrest.
Then, in the winter of 1799, the government decided that Tennent and 19 other United Irishmen were still so great a threat that they should be transported to a fortress in a remote corner of Scotland. As William Tennent set sail under armed guard, he was unsure whether he would see his family or Belfast ever again.
After a grueling 2-week journey, on the 9th of April 1799, Tennent and his fellow prisoners finally arrived in this forbidding place, Fort George, just outside Inverness in the Scottish Highlands.
Tennent had become accustomed to all the luxuries that money could buy. He'd been free to travel wherever he wanted, and he'd also dined at the lavish tables of the cream of Belfast society. Now, as he entered the cell that was waiting for him, he left all those trappings behind.
William Tennent was incarcerated here for 3 years. In a diary entry, one of his fellow prisoners at Fort George captured just how desperate and grim their situation was. He wrote,
"We were captives in a foreign land, under the control of military strangers, far removed from friend or acquaintance and the consoling endearments of parent, brother, wife, or children.
Tennent also kept his own diary, and it offers brief glimpses into the physical toll that the long hours of confinement took upon him.
He was often in poor health. He writes that he took a vomit of salts, vinegar and water to soothe severe stomach pains. He also writes that he suffered with inflammation of the eyes and underwent some rough surgery for swollen tonsils.
There were, however, some consolations. The prisoners were allowed books, and in these, Tennent took great comfort. In fact, he built up quite a substantial library with texts on a range of subjects, from medicine to ancient Greece and Rome, history, philosophy, and of course, politics.
Still, the time dragged for Tennent. He struggled to endure the grinding monotony of prison life. But finally, in November 1801, after 3 long years, he received the news that he had hoped for. He was to be released.
Along with 4 other prisoners, also suspected United Irishmen, he was a free man, and he set sail for Ireland. After a pleasant crossing, carriages were waiting at Holywood to take them to Belfast, where their friends and family were ready to welcome them home.
While Tennent was imprisoned in Fort George, Belfast had undergone its own transformation. Enthusiasm for revolutionary politics had been dampened, to say the least, by the public execution of the United Irishmen. The political landscape had also changed. The Rising had convinced the British government to exert greater control over Ireland and to dissolve the Irish Parliament. Irish peers and MPs now sat in Westminster. And so it was that the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland came into effect in January 1801.
So Belfast in 1798 is really arguably the most radical town, not only in Ireland, but the whole of the British Isles. Where does the radical energy it used to have go?
It's tempting to say, actually, that it doesn't go anywhere. That radical energy, if you like, is still there, but that the political context has changed. 1798, the rebellion, the bloodshed in Ireland changes the context, makes people think again. And so that radical energy in people like William Drennan, in people like Robert and William Tennent, is still there, but if you like, it's modified. It's maybe moderated a little by the change of context. The point is, though, that these people are still pushing for reform. They're pushing for parliamentary reform. They're pushing for Catholic emancipation. These are the things that they had been pushing for in the 1790s, but they're doing them in a changed political context, and they're doing them within, or pushing for them within, the context of the union between Great Britain and Ireland.
So tell us about the culture of Belfast in this period, after the rebellion, after the Act of Union. What type of things are going on in town?
People, when they think about 19th century Belfast, tend to think about shipyards, heavy industry. They think of Belfast as a workshop of the British Empire. But in the early 19th century, there's a sort of a different Belfast that exists. Belfast is known at that time, among some people, as the Athens of the North. And that phrase, the Athens of the North, is first used in relation to Belfast in the late 18th century. And it's used, in a sense, to refer to the kind of libertarian or radical principles of the people of Belfast. But it also has a cultural connotation and a cultural dimension, because Belfast at that time is starting to develop kind of a civic society, cultural and intellectual institutions, and that process develops then on into the early 19th century. So you have in Belfast the Society for Promoting Knowledge, you have the Literary Society, the Historic Society, you have some short-lived societies as well, the Galvanic Society, the Phrenological Society in the 1820s, and then established in 1821, the Natural History and Philosophical Society. So you get this sense when you look at these societies of Belfast being still a fairly small town, not quite the industrial powerhouse that it becomes later in the 19th century, but a town with a sort of a kind of a vibrant, energetic middle class that's establishing these societies and that's really creating a place for itself in public life.
Under the Act of Union, Belfast was to flourish as a crucial cog in the wheels of the British Empire. The completion of Clarendon Dock at the beginning of the 19th century had opened up the port to even more global trade. And now the increasingly wealthy middle class, dominated by Presbyterian merchants such as William Tennent, began to take the lead in the cultural and intellectual life of the town.
William Tennent was aware of his luck. His radical politics had led him to the brink of ruin. But he was now a free man, ready to resume his career as one of Belfast's most successful merchants.
He was ready to cultivate a new image as a pillar of respectability in the town through public service and philanthropic work. When in 1804 the Belfast newsletter observed that the new stately and elegant homes around the town reflected the taste and opulence that reigned in Belfast, it was referring to the dwellings of men like William Tennent. Tennent lived in a residence like this on Hercules Place, a street that was demolished during the Victorian expansion of Belfast, to make way for Royal Avenue.
But behind closed doors, Tennent conducted a private life that was far from conventional, which involved mistresses and more than a whiff of scandal. You would expect the details of such a colourful private life to be hidden or destroyed. Far from it. They are in fact preserved in the family archive. So it's fair to say that William Tennent had an unconventional private life.
Yes, I think it is. He did get married. He was married for 2 years, from 1805 to 1807. He was married to a woman called Eleanor Jackson, but she died very shortly after they were married. They had one child, Letitia, who then becomes his legitimate heir. But in between his marriage, before his marriage and after his marriage, William Tennent did live an unconventional life. He had a series of mistresses, and he had a large number of children outside marriage, apart from Letitia. I've counted 13 children that he had with a number of different women. We know the most about 2 of the mistresses who wrote to him and whose letters we have here. One is Anne Henry, the other is Margaret McCabe. And he treats them very differently. With Margaret McCabe, he gives her money, and she's clearly sending him, as we can see there, begging letters, asking for money. 2 of her sons live with another mistress, Anne Henry, who is the second woman who turns up a lot in the correspondence. And Anne Henry is the woman that William Tennent has the most long-term relationship with. He met her before he went to prison in the 1790s, and he's still with her in the 1820s, when I think she probably died.
So he has this lifelong relationship with Anne Henry, both before and after he gets married. Why didn't he simply marry her?
Yeah, that is the key question in their relationship. I think his marriage to Eleanor Jackson was going to move him up that social scale that he was anxious to climb. Anne Henry is well looked after, both before and after he marries. But if you read her letters, she's saying all the time, I live a very quiet life. At one stage she says, I'm ashamed to go out if I'm pregnant, as she frequently was with his children, or to go out even just after I've given birth to a child.
I am present in your house. I slept in your bed last night. I hope to hear from you soon, and receiving a letter from you, my dear Mr. Tennent, will give me a great deal of satisfaction. I long to know how you've been since you left home.
Now, what's interesting also about the letters that have survived from Anne Henry is that William kept the letters she wrote to him when he told her he was getting married. And she was clearly absolutely devastated by it. But indirectly, I think you could almost see his affection for her, that he kept them.
Tennent may have had a deep affection for Anne Henry and other women in his life, and provided for his many children. But by marrying into a landed family, he was, first and foremost, taking care of business, and doing so extremely successfully.
In the years following his incarceration at Fort George, he became Belfast's richest man. He became director of a successful shipping company and bought and resold a range of goods, from beef and pork to tobacco and whiskey and rum. He also, along with his fellow merchants, established Belfast's commercial bank.
Tennent also became deeply involved in the running of the town, serving as a committee member on a number of newly established public bodies, ranging from the police commissioners to the Belfast Society for Promoting Knowledge. There are very few images of the elusive William Tennent, but here is a portrait commissioned in 1810. And the painting tells a story in its own right. Tennent appears as an elder statesman. He's grey round the temples, he's dressed like a gentleman. He, of course, has asked for this painting to be completed and has paid for it.
so he's clearly thinking in terms of his reputation and his legacy. Indeed, he's looking to the future, perhaps also wanting to leave some of the whiff of scandal behind him. And he is to become an even more important citizen in the history of Belfast.
One area of the city's life in which William Tennent was to have a lasting influence was education. This was something he believed in passionately, and in 1814, he became one of the founders of the Academical Institution, the city centre grammar school that we know today as Inst.
Tennent and other former radicals, such as William Tennent, gave money for the building to be constructed on this land granted to them by the Marquess of Donegal, which at the time was just a green space at the edge of town.
The aim of the new college was to educate boys from the middling orders of society, to be a place where education would be seen as a necessity, not a luxury of life. However, just 2 years after it opened, the school was almost forced to close its doors, thanks to a flare-up of the old rebellious spirit at a dinner attended by William and his brother, Robert Tennent.
This was an extraordinary affair that occurred on St. Patrick's Day 1816 in Gillett's Hotel in Arthur Street, Belfast, where 50 of Belfast's radicals, I suppose, gathered to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. Perhaps fueled by an overindulgence in wine, a considerable number of what at the time were regarded as disloyal oaths were drunk. And there were long-term consequences, both for the individuals involved and for the institution.
In an increasingly conservative Belfast, news of the dinner soon reached the newspapers, and there was a public outcry at what were considered disloyal toasts.
I can see here this cutting from the Belfast Commercial Chronicle, maybe from the Monday after the dinner. St. Patrick's Day evening, Gillett's Hotel, Dr. Tennent is called to the chair, and a whole list of toasts are read out, like Erin go Bra and a toast to civil liberty and political independence to the people of every clime and every colour. Could you tell me a little bit more about these?
Yes. I suppose one of the more contentious of the oaths that were drunk on this occasion, to the memory of Marshal Ney, Marshal Michael Ney, one of Napoleon Bonaparte's most loyal military officers, who only months earlier, I believe in December 1815, had been sentenced to death and executed following the Battle of Waterloo. To us reading these now, they appear innocuous enough, but at the time, given that we are within 20 years of the ending of the 1798 rebellion, these toasts would have been seen perhaps as provocative, inappropriate, and even inimical to the British Constitution.
And so that embroiled the school in some controversy?
Absolutely. The school lost its annual grant of £1,500, a considerable sum of money in the early 19th century, bringing long-term financial hardship to Belfast Academical Institution.
So did this represent, if you like, an attempt to keep alive the spirit of 1798 and the rebellion of that year?
I wouldn't say being kept alive. I would have thought that this was the dying embers of radical Belfast, the death throes of the men of 1798. These were old men who 20 years on were having their last jaunt, if you like.
By the 1820s, Belfast was entering another phase of development. The population had expanded to more than 40,000 people. The intellectual life of the town, although no longer revolutionary, was still incredibly vibrant. In a sign of the times, in 1820, the cottages that once stood here on Waring Street were knocked down and replaced by this grand commercial building, a hotel, and a gentleman's club. But an even more significant development was on the horizon. And it was to come about thanks to the fall in the fortunes of another man, Belfast's landlord, George Augustus Chichester, the second Marquess of Donegal. The Marquess and his family arrived in Belfast in 1802, after almost 100 years of being absentee landlords. But he did so with a stack of gambling debts and creditors at his heels. The Marquess moved his family here, to what is now Ormeau Park. But he wanted to build a bigger and grander home, and was in dire need of cash. His only asset, though, was the land he owned in and around Belfast, so he put almost all of it up for sale. It was quickly bought up by the wealthy people of Belfast, eager to own the land on which their homes and businesses stood.
The biggest investor of all was William Tennent. He bought 20 pieces of property and land stretching from the High Street right through to the Shankill Road. So the Donegals had their Tudor mansion, of which this is the last remaining part. But the merchants and professionals of Belfast finally owned their own town.
William Tennent also bought up land elsewhere in Ireland, including estates in Tyrone, Sligo and Donegal. Among his acquisitions was this beautiful domain in Tempo, County Fermanagh. More than he could ever have imagined when he set out from his modest rural home at Roseyards as a young man eager to make his fortune. Now, as he entered old age, Tennent was able to enjoy the fruits of his labour on his occasional stays at Tempo. Ironically, for a man who ended up owning so much of Belfast, Tempo Manor is the only one of William Tennent's properties that has remained in the hands of his descendants.
Tempo itself was 18,000 acres when he bought it, and I think he paid £1,750 for it. But it would have been a very beautiful estate. I mean, it's got lakes, rivers, very, very pretty part of the world.
This is something of a rags to riches story. William Tennent is famous as a merchant, and that's how he makes his money. But then he buys into the land. Is that something that still echoes in the family?
I think there's quite a lot. I mean, we've all lived off, really been living off a lot of the work that they did, and through generations or through time, different families do have people that do very, very well for themselves, and I think that William Tennent did terribly well, which has sort of kept us going since. But I mean, you know, obviously still trying to keep it as best as we can to then, but it's not getting quite the same breaks as maybe as they got at their time.
William Tennent and his friends never quite achieved the radical, sweeping reforms that they had envisaged as young men in the United Irish movement. But the system did begin to change. And in 1832, the Great Reform Act of that year began to push Britain along the road to democracy.
Crucially, the Marquess of Donegal no longer had the sole right to choose Belfast MPs. Now 1,300 property owners in the town could vote to select their parliamentary representatives.
William Tennent was identified as a candidate to stand at the election. But before he could do so, tragedy struck. A cholera epidemic swept across Belfast. More than 400 people died, and William Tennent was one of them.
Perhaps it was William Tennent's determination to remain in the heart of Belfast that sealed his fate. Long after the wealthier citizens had moved to the tranquility of the rural outskirts, William Tennent stayed at his home in Hercules Place. When cholera struck, he was right at the centre of the epidemic. But there was one last twist in the story. At the 1832 election, it was William Tennent's son-in-law, James Emerson Tennent, husband of his daughter Letitia, who was elected as one of Belfast's 2 MPs. But James's political inclinations were very different to those of William and the wider Tennent family.
James Emerson Tennent, in fact, became a Conservative. While his father-in-law would have been horrified, it was a sign of how Belfast was changing into the Victorian era, moving away from liberalism to conservatism. And it was James Emerson who took the Tennent family name to London, becoming close friends not only with Charles Dickens, but the British Conservative Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel.
In the 1850s, Tennent's family erected the elaborate memorial to him in First Presbyterian Church in Belfast, Rosemary Street. But here, among the great and good of Clifton Street Cemetery, it's curious that there is no trace of such an eminent man's name on any of these gravestones.
Now that is the Sinclair family, famous Belfast family. Now that is William Drennan, famous citizen of Belfast, which means that now this is the Tennent family plot. It was bought by William Tennent in 1802 in Clifton Street Cemetery, but actually there's nothing left on the headstone, which means that you could say the final resting place of William Tennent remains a mystery.
And yet, it would somehow be fitting if Tennent's grave was here, alongside those of the United Irishmen he outlived, Henry Joy McCracken, Thomas Sinclair, and William Drennan. For after all, he shared their passions and believed until the end of his days that change was possible. In the words of one historian, in the period when William Tennent played such an important role in its development, Belfast was a Presbyterian town. Now it was poised to become a mighty industrial city. Within a century of Tennent's death, its population would expand from 40,000 people to 350,000.
And perhaps more than any inscription on a gravestone or any fancy memorial, this extraordinary man, who was self-made and perhaps somewhat flawed, should be remembered in the following way: as a citizen who devoted his life to Belfast and whose efforts helped shape the city it was to become.